A Captivity in Serpens by Clark Ashton Smith. Chapter 1. This world, said Volmar, plainly belongs to the Mercurian type. One side is always presented to the sun, the other confronts eternal night, though it may be that there is a very slow and incomplete diurnal rotation. One hemisphere, as we have seen, is a blazing desert, and the other is sheeted with ice and frozen snow, except for the twilight zone in which we have landed. After 8 unbroken months of ether voyaging in their attempted circuit of the universe, Captain Volmar and his men had felt the need of stretching their legs again on some sort of terra firma. The cramped quarters of the ether ship Alcyone, the monotony of a never-ceasing flight through spatial emptiness and darkness, with only far-strewn suns and systems and nebulae for mileposts, had palled on everyone, even the ascetically ardent Volmar. A brief respite on some planetary body was deemed advisable. They had made a number of such pauses during their half-decade of journeying. They were nearing a lesser unnamed sun in Serpens when this decision was made. Of course, the sun might not possess a planetary system. However, as they drew closer, the Alcyone's telescopic reflectors revealed 4 planets that were circling it in wide-flung orbits. In the position which it then occupied, the innermost world was nearer to the spaceship than the others, and it soon attracted the curiosity of the voyagers by its odd markings. Between the deserts of the sunlit hemisphere and the ice fields and mountains that glimmered palely on the nightward side beneath 2 diminutive moons, a dark, narrow zone, suggesting vegetation, was visible. A zone that encircled the planet from pole to pole. Clouds and vapors above this penumbral belt had proved the presence of an atmosphere. A landing had been made, and Captain Volmar, Jasper the mate, Roverton, and the other members of the crew had emerged cautiously from the flyer's manhole after determining the temperature and chemical constituents of the outside air. The temperature was moderate, about 60 degrees, but the existence of 1 or 2 unknown, uncertain gases in the air had denoted the advisability of wearing masks and carrying oxygen tanks. Equipped with these, and armed with automatics, the party sallied forth into a strange landscape. The Alcyone had descended on a low, level, open hilltop. The ground resembled a coarse turf, and was pale blue in color. When the men trod upon it for the first time, they found that it was not covered with anything in the least related to grass, but with a peculiar growth 2 or 3 inches high, like a thin, branching fungus. It was not rooted in the soil, and it fell over or crumbled readily beneath the footsteps of the explorers. They could see plainly enough in the weird twilight, strengthened as it was by the glimmering of the 2 moons, one of which was crescent and the other gibbous. Far off, a row of mound-like hills, interspersed with sharp dolomites, was outlined on an afterglow of torrid saffron that soared in deepening rays to assail the green heavens. A few stars and the other planets of the system were visible. Volmar and his men approached the edge of the hilltop. Below them, a long, undulant slope descended to a plain covered with a dark vegetation which they had descried from afar in space. It was a mass of purples and blues and mauves, ranging from the palest to the darkest tints, and it seemed to vary in height from shrub-like growths to things that presented the size, if not the natural aspect, of full-grown forest trees. Some of the smaller forms, like an advance guard, had climbed midway on the acclivity. They were very heavy at the base, with dwindling boles like inverted carrots, and many nodular outbranchings of an irregularity more grotesque than that of any Terran cacti. The lower branches appeared to touch the ground with the ungainly sprawl of crab or tarantula legs. "I'd like to have a look at those things," said Volmar. "Do you want to come with me, Roverton? The rest of you fellows had best remain within sight of the flyer. We haven't seen any sort of animate life yet, but there's no telling what might be lurking in the neighborhood." He and Roverton went down the slope, with the fungoid turf crunching beneath their feet. They neared the foremost plant forms rather cautiously, remembering their unpleasant experiences with flesh-eating trees and vegetables on other worlds. These forms, however, though they were extremely uncouth and even ugly, displayed none of the usual characteristics of carnivorous plants. What are they? Volmar was frankly puzzled. Cacti? Fungi? Aerophytes? I don't believe they have any root systems at all. They look as if one could knock them over very easily. He approached one of the short, heavy bowls and pushed it with his foot. It fell to the ground and lay sprawling with its thick, ungainly limbs in the air. Unlike the tiny growths underfoot, it was very tough and rubbery, and none of its branches were broken or in any wise injured by the fall. On the contrary, they had bent with elastic ease where they were caught underneath the bowl. "The thing must be an air plant," said Volmar. "I don't see any sign of root attachments." He was turning away when Roverton touched his arm. "What do you think of that, Captain?" The overthrown plant was moving, albeit with great slowness and sluggishness, in a manifest effort to right itself. The top heaved. The branches that were doubled beneath it seemed to straighten and lengthen, while those beneath the base contracted. The thing was plainly trying to secure a sort of leverage. At last, after several vain attempts, it resumed an upright position, on the very same spot from which Volmar had displaced it. "That's interesting," Volmar commented. "These things have the power of mobility when such is needed. I wouldn't be surprised if all this vegetation were migratory. Doubtless it has developed the ability to move from place to place on account of the severely changing climatic conditions. In all likelihood, the habitable twilight zone shifts more or less during the planet's annual rotation, and these plants follow it, to avoid the extreme heat of full daylight or the utter cold of darkness. If there is any animal life, it is probably nomadic also." "Shall we go on?" asked Roverton. "That forest at the bottom of the hill should be worthy of study." "All right," assented Volmar, "but we mustn't wander too far from the others. There's no use taking chances in an unexplored world. We've done that before, and have gotten into some tight places." 100 yards, and they were among the outposts of the strange forest. Many of the growths resembled the first shrubs in type, though they were heavier and taller. Others grew in recumbent positions, like vast vegetable centipedes or many-legged monsters. Some retracted their outer limbs in a sluggish caution before the approach of the men, but most of them did not appear to move at all. There seemed to be nothing to fear from these plants. So Volmar and Roverton went on among the irregularly scattered groups, examining them with much curiosity. So far, they had seen no evidence whatever of animal or insect life. In their scientific absorption, the explorers did not realize how far they had wandered till they saw that the plants around them were becoming higher and thicker. Many of them were 20 or 30 feet tall, and they stood so close that further progress among them was difficult. "I guess we'd better turn back," said Volmar. He and Roverton started to retrace their steps, which were plainly marked in the trodden fungi. To their surprise, when they had gone only a little distance, they found that their path was now blocked in many places by thickets of the strange trees, which must have closed in stealthily behind their passing, though no movement of this sort had been discernible at the time. Perhaps these plants had been impelled to follow them by some obscure instinct or stirring of curiosity. But evidently they were not aggressive or dangerous, and their motor activity was of the most torpid kind. Because of this rearrangement of the growths, however, the men were compelled to divagate from their direct route as they returned toward the Alcyone. But they did not anticipate any real difficulty, and were not likely to go astray, since the low hill from which they had descended was visible in many places above the tops of the vegetation. Presently they came to some old footmarks, characterized by 3 toes of preternatural length and sharpness. The prints were very far apart, suggesting that their originator was possessed of phenomenally long legs. Volmar and Roverton followed the tracks, insomuch as these appeared to be going in the general direction of the space flyer. But a little further on, in the lee of a dense clump of vegetation, the tracks entered a huge burrow, into which the men could almost have walked without stooping, on a gentle incline. Both eyed it rather warily as they passed, but there was no visible sign of its occupant.
"I'm not sure I'd care to meet with that customer, whatever it is," observed Roverton. "Probably it's some loathsome, overgrown insect."
They had gone perhaps 70 feet beyond the burrow's entrance, when the ground suddenly caved in beneath Volmar, who was in the lead, and he disappeared from Roverton's sight. Hastening to the edge of the hole into which his companion had fallen, Roverton met a similar fate, for the ground crumbled beneath him, and he was precipitated into a dark pit 7 or 8 feet deep, landing beside Volmar. Both were a little bruised by the fall, but were otherwise unhurt. They had broken through into the burrow, whose entrance they could now see from where they were lying. The place was filled with a noisome, mephitic smell, and was damp with disagreeable oozings. Picking themselves up, the men started toward the entrance at once, hoping that the burrow's owner had not been aroused by their involuntary intrusion. As they approached the mouth, they were startled by a medley of shrill, piping sounds which arose from without, the first sounds they had heard in this fantastic world. As they drew still nearer, they saw the silhouettes of 2 figures that were standing just outside the cave. The figures were bipedal, with thick legs of disproportionate shortness, and arms that reached almost to the ground. The heads could not be seen from within the tunnel. These extraordinary beings were stretching a narrow, heavy-stranded net, weighted at the ends with balls of metal or mineral, which they held between them across the entrance. They continued their piping noise, and their voices grew shriller still, and took on an odd, cajoling note. Volmar and Roverton had paused.
"Now what?"
whispered Roverton. "I think," Volmar whispered in reply, "that those creatures, whoever or whatever they are, must be waiting for the owner of the burrow to come out. They have tracked it, or perhaps have even driven it here. Probably they're planning to wind that net around its long legs when it emerges."
"Or," suggested Roverton, "maybe they saw us fall into the pit and are planning to take us captive."
They returned cautiously toward the caved-in portion of the burrow, and stopped when they saw that several more of the weird hunters, some of them equipped with nets and others armed with trident-headed lances, were grouped around the opening above and were peering down. The heads of these beings were even more peculiar than their limbs, and were quite hideous from a human standpoint. They possessed 3 eyes, 2 of which were set obliquely in close juxtaposition to a slit-like mouth, surrounded with waving or drooping tentacles, and the other near the top of a long, sloping brow that was lined with sparse bristles. There were rudimentary projections from each jowl that might have been either ears or wattles, but nothing even remotely suggestive of nostrils was detectable. The whole expression was supremely wild and ferocious.
"Can't say that I admire the looks of those customers," murmured Roverton. "Plainly they're a hunting party, and we, or the occupant of this burrow, or both, have been marked out as their meat."
The guards at the entrance had continued their piping song. Suddenly it seemed to find a far-off echo in the depths of the cavern. The sound approached and grew louder and shriller. Volmar and Roverton could see the gleaming of two greenish phosphorescent eyes in the darkness beyond the circle of dim light that fell from the caved-in roof. "The hunters are luring that beast," said Volmar, "by imitating the voices of its own kind." He and Roverton, with their automatics ready, now retreated slowly toward the entrance, watching over their shoulders as they went to the phosphoric eyes that continued to advance from the gloom. Now they could see two enormous, spraddling, many-jointed legs, and a squat, shaggy face, and a globe-like body, and then the two hind legs as the creature came into the light. Somehow it was more like an insect than an animal, like some gargantuan, overnourished arachnid. As the monster passed beneath the opening, the two men saw the flash of a spear cast by one of the watchers above. It sank into the dark, hairy body, and the piping rose to a harsh scream as the creature leapt forward upon Volmar and Roverton. With their automatics flaming and crackling in the gloom, the men turned and ran toward the entrance. Their maddened pursuer, seemingly undeterred by the bullets, was close upon their heels. The weighted net was still stretched across the burrow's mouth, and Volmar and Roverton now fired their last cartridges at the legs of the two beings who held it. Both of these creatures fell sprawling and dropped the net. The men burst forth into the light, only to find themselves confronted by a dozen similar beings, all armed with nets or spears. These bizarre hunters gave no evidence of fear or surprise at the appearance of the earthlings, but proceeded with calm, methodical swiftness to form in a ring. The men rushed upon them, hoping to break through, but with ineluctable speed and deftness each was entangled in the heavy meshes cast about him, and went to the ground with pinioned arms and legs. Their automatics had fallen from their fingers and were beyond reach. Lying helpless, they saw the emerging of the monster that had driven them from the burrow. It was neatly trapped in its turn by the guards, and it lay palpitating on the ground, bleeding a thick bluish fluid from the spear and bullet wounds it had received.